Welcome to episode 4 of Myth vs. Craft, where I set out to interview interesting people who excel at what they do. My guest today is guitar icon David Grissom. A guitarist guitar player, he's also an accomplished songwriter, sought-after sideman, and successful solo artist. David has toured and recorded with a long list of prominent artists, including Joe Ely, John Mellencamp, Storyville, the Allman Brothers Band, the Dixie Chicks, Chris Isaak, Ringo Starr, Buddy Guy, and many more. You can learn more about David, check out his calendar, and find his music at davidgrissom.com. If you're ever in Austin, do yourself a favor and go see David and his band at the Saxon Pub any Tuesday night. Here we go. David, welcome to the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
I read that you started out playing drums and later switched to guitar, which, by the way, I read that Joe Satriani also was a drummer first.
Really? Yeah.
What made you switch to the guitar?
Revolver, the Beatles record. I heard Revolver, and basically, I specifically got to get you into my life. There's a guitar lick that happens about a minute 30 into the song. I don't know who's playing it. George Harrison, who knows? They all play guitar, but it's the guitar line that mimics the horn line, da 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 down 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 down. And when I heard that, it was like that was magic. I heard magic, and when I was in a restaurant with my wife the other day, and the song came on, and I said, "You got to listen to this lick. You got to listen to this lick." And it has this little bend in it with two string. The top note is not bent, the bottom note is bent, and then let down. And it's just so, that one lick, I hear me, the way I play. So much of the style that I've, tried to develop from that one lick. And the whole record really, and then Paperback Writer was recorded on the same sessions, and the tone of that guitar, it just grabbed me.
How long did it take you to figure out or to learn that lick?
I didn't learn how to play it correctly until about 2 years ago. And the weird thing about it is I thought I knew how to play it until I really listened to it. And the lick goes up. It's like, on the first and third string, and on the way up, it has the major seventh in it. And on the way down, it has the dominant seventh in it. And I never think of doing that. And so I was like, after all these years, I'm like, that's it. How did I miss that all these years?
I've been reading a handful of biographies of musicians and listening to other podcasts, and it's incredible how many people can trace back their start, basically the trigger, the genesis of everything related to music to the Beatles. In many cases, depending on their age, their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, and in other cases, just listening to it.
Well, I didn't. Yeah, I don't know that I ever. I mean, I think I was a little young for the Ed Sullivan Show, but yeah, it was Revolver. And throughout my formative years, whatever you want to call it, high school, there were numerous things like that where maybe it was one song on a record, maybe it was one solo on a record, where the rest of the album didn't really float my boat that much, but it was this one solo. There was something about it that to this day I hear it, and it influenced me so deeply. And it was across all styles. And that was the thing about growing up in a small town where there wasn't a big music scene, and in an era where it was kind of like you had to really search to find music. It wasn't like everything was on YouTube immediately. So you couldn't get on Spotify and listen to anything and everything immediately. So whenever I would find one of those gems that was, these like moments of magic, and that's really what, to me, I strive, if I ever can write a lick or hear a new song like out of the box, that moment of magic, that's what has been like this light that I've followed.
You mentioned growing up in a small town. I believe that was Louisville, Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
I read that you were exposed to a lot of jazz and bluegrass.
Yeah.
And that one of your guitar teachers early on turned you on to Wes Montgomery.
Yeah.
I think that was at 15. How deeply did you get into jazz?
I got in deep enough to really, I think, give me the invaluable extra depth of harmony. And in the process of working with that teacher, he taught me, I learned to read a little bit. I don't read well, but I read a little bit. I'd never played a major seventh chord. until, I mean, I didn't even know what that was. And so the harmony and theory, a little bit of reading, the ability to read a chart, follow, just to navigate a chart, to understand modes, to understand um, the degrees of the major scale and how that worked with chords. All those things kind of were in have been invaluable to me. Um, I learned pretty quickly that to be a great jazz player is a full-time commitment. And there were so many other styles of music that were pulling at me that I in no way, shape, or form claim to be a jazz player. I mean, I know enough to get in trouble, to get into a situation where I'm gonna get busted if I stick around too long. But I just went out and did 3 weeks with Robin Ford playing in his band,
Wow.
and there were there was a few moments where I really had like I know how to do this. I haven't done it in a long time, and some soloing over some changes that were really like, altered scales and chords that went by really, really fast. It wasn't just diatonic or modal stuff at all. Some of the times, and it was fun to jump back into that, be challenged, and sort of not fall on my face. And that all goes back to that spending the time with that teacher. But Wes, whether I can play, I can't begin to approach the level of sophistication of what he was doing, but what a beacon and what a source of inspiration to this day. I mean, and if nothing else, even if harmonically I can't do it, his feel and his spirit definitely transmits to me. I mean, I definitely feel like the way he swings and his rhythmic sense, phrasing, that's one thing, and going back to playing drums, I do approach things very rhythmically. You can take the simplest harmony with a few notes, and if you're inventive with it rhythmically, you can create something unique in that way too. So phrasing, Wes, Jocko, Michael Brecker, the saxophone player, his phrasing really influenced me a lot. And so again, not having I haven't put in the time to really be developed as on a deep harmonic level, but I've been greatly influenced in other ways.
Hmm. You touch on something very important, but I think that many guitar players in particular don't pay attention to, which is the importance of rhythm, not just in terms of rhythm playing, but in terms of improvisation and playing lead. And I've two different guitar players I've seen or I've heard mention that are Paul Gilbert. I remember at some point watching an instructional video of his, where he mentioned that whenever he acquired had a first lesson with a new student, one of the first things he would ask them to do is to improvise, but exclusively rhythmically. And don't play notes, don't worry about the chord changes, the scales, don't worry about anything else, just rhythmically improvise or show me what you can do. And that would immediately let him know more. That was the first gauge that he would use to determine where the student was.
Yeah.
And the other one is John Frusciante, the ex guitar player of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Yeah. And in his case, he saw it more so in terms of playing out of rhythm, and in terms of just accelerating and decelerating, making it much more organic,
Yeah.
and not just falling right on the dot.
But I think, yeah, and I totally dig that. And I think you have to, but I think to do that effectively, you have to sort of be able to play in time and in the pocket before you can legitimately play around with the time. It's like, in sessions, great session players, everything we do now, 95% of records that are made are cut with a click track. Great drummers and bass players, rhythm sections can fudge a little bit, can maybe knock the tempo, get on the front side of the beat on the chorus to give some sort of energy lift, and then fall back maybe on the back side a little bit on the verse. But man, that is a fine art. And it's, a lot of times guys will say they're doing that when they're rushing or dragging, and it's like, no.
Going back to when you were first starting, what can you tell me about your first bands, your first shows, when you really started playing with other people?
Well, the first time I started playing with the first time I actually played in a band situation was with some guys I went to high school with, and it was, doing Allman Brothers and BB King stuff. Um, the first time I actually started playing gigs was with like an R&B band where I happened to be the only white guy in the band, and we did like Earth, Wind and Fire, Crusaders, um, George Benson, all that kind of stuff. And we would play, we played some clubs in Louisville, and that was, those were the first truly paying gigs I did. And then when I went to college for a year and got into a band in Bloomington, Indiana, I went to IU for a year. Happened to get in a band with a bunch of guys who were older than me, one of whom was Kenny Aronoff, the drummer.
Stream winner?
Stream winner. And we kind of toured the Midwest playing the rock clubs in the Midwest, but we were playing everything from like Steely Dan to Weather Report. And I would convince them that we needed to throw an Allman Brothers tune in there from time to time, and writing our own tunes as well. But that was a great experience. That was really great experience.
You mentioned that you attended for 1 year. Was your major music all along?
I went for music and realized that then I quit for 2 years and went on the road. And after that, I realized that I was going to learn a lot more about music playing gigs than I was going to class.
Perhaps regret is too strong a word, but do you regret that first year, or do you feel like that
No.
at the very least got you
No.
in touch with
I
all
don't
these
regret
people?
anything. I mean, I think everything along the way has been necessary to get me to where I am now. And I never would have met Kenny, and I ended up playing with Mellencamp, and being around those guys. They were all graduates of IU School of Music, and I was just 18 years old, and I mean I was just trying to keep up, and they were heavy players, and they took me in, and I don't regret that at all. It was and really at the time I didn't know what I wanted to do exactly or how I was going to go about doing it, so that gave me the time to get the experience, be around some great players, develop some great relationships. And then all of a sudden I found that I started listening to all this new kind of music, and it was Joe Ely, Lou Ann Barton, the Fabulous Thunderbirds, and I realized it's all happening in this place called Austin, Texas. And since I was in high school and I was a big ZZ Top fan, and since the day I got Tres Hombres and opened up the jacket and saw that big plate of Mexican food sitting there on the table in that full, when albums were really big, and I fantasized about I want to live where you can eat that food, and so the stars kind of aligned at that point, and it was just like I woke up one day and I was ready to move, and I had a friend who lived here in Austin. She let me come down and stay with her to check the place out. I was here for about 5 nights. I went down to the Continental Club, heard the Cobras. I went to Huts and heard Angela Straley. Flew back home, packed up my Honda Civic, and turned right back around and got down here. And I've been here ever since.
This was 83?
83.
Can you pinpoint the moment at which you decided that you wanted to take a shot at making a career in music?
I don't think I ever didn't feel that way. I mean, at 12, you're not really thinking about, well, what am I going to do for a living? But about the time I can remember being 15 or 16 thinking, this is everything. This is it.
Did you ever have a backup plan, or you never even considered doing anything else?
Well, I took some business courses just in case. And they've actually served me really well, to be honest with you. I mean, I can read a contract. I've never had a manager. I've always negotiated my own deals. God willing, I mean, I knew that this is what I wanted to do, and if I would cross the bridge when I came to it, if it didn't work out. But somehow, I guess, the naivety of youth, I was convinced that it was absolutely going to work out. And I had some experiences that were sort of affirming for me. The great jazz guitar player named Jimmy Rainey, who was from Louisville, he played with Charlie Parker in the 50s. I got to go to his house and take a lesson with him. And basically we just played, and we played like, some jazz standards. We just opened up a book and read the chords and played together. And it was an out of body experience in a way, because it was like in his presence, I all of a sudden was playing, like really playing, making the changes and really playing. And, we had a conversation at the end of the hour, and he said, well, like, what are you going to do? I mean, what are your plans? And I said, well, I'd like to do this for a living. I hope I can make it. And he looked at me, and he's just really matter of factly said, oh, you're going to make it. There's no doubt you're going to make it. And it was like, it wasn't a feeling, it was a I felt humbled by that. It didn't make me cocky, but it was a gift that he gave me, the way he said it, and allowing me to come into his house and to play with me for an hour. It was special.
And he was right.
He turned out to be right. Yeah.
You moved to Austin in '83. How soon after that did you start playing in Joe Ely's band?
I started with Joe in '85. So in '83, when I got here, I immediately went over to the Highland Mall here and got a job working at Musicland Record Store. And my friend, who I came to visit earlier, let me sleep on her floor for 3 weeks. And back then, there were a lot more situations where you could just go out and sit in with people. And really, people were pretty cool about letting you come up there. I mean, I had to sort of, talk to them, meet them, let them know who I was. But in doing that, I really met a ton of people. But the big thing, like, I've been here 2 weeks, and I'd called up the writer from the paper here, the music writer, which is like something you really don't do. And I told him who I was and where I was from, and does he know anybody that's looking for a guitar player? And he was real brusque with me. And a guy named Ed Ward, he's a great guy, but knowing what I know now, I never would have made that phone call. And he said, well, I'm not a matchmaker. I mean, I don't know if you're any good or not, but if you are any good, there's a girl named Lucinda Williams who's looking for a guitar player. You want her phone number? I said, sure. So I called her up out of the blue and went over and played with her. And like a week later, I was going to the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival with her to play down there. And shortly, I mean, actually, almost like the day we left, they wanted to add another guitar player, and they added a guy named Derek O'Brien, who is to this day one of my favorite blues players. And he was like in the Antone's house band and everything. And so we became really close friends and really admired each other's playing. I think it's safe to say he was playing with Lou Ann Barton at the time. He got me in Lou Ann's band. So then all of a sudden, now, I'm playing with Lucinda and Lou Ann. And so by virtue of being in Lou Ann's band, I can go into Antone's anytime I want for free, which meant every single night. And I got, it was really a lucky situation.
Did that come naturally to you? Are you a pretty outgoing guy and calling up and meeting people and networking and sitting in, or was that something you just realized you had to do and you forced yourself to do it?
I forced myself to do it. I just wanted to make something happen. And I felt I kind of felt like I was good enough to, I was ready to do it. I had a lot of energy, and I think there was a lot of energy in my playing, but at the same time, I had enough experience and enough guidance from the people who I'd played with before about how to really accompany a vocalist, how not to overplay, how to adapt to situations where if I'm the only guitar player, if there's two guitar players. I had enough of a start on that I was far enough along to where I could get into these situations. And once I got there, I just soaked up every last drop of knowledge I could get for these guys that were more experienced. And, at Antone's, I would just like religiously study, Denny Freeman, Derek, David Murray. He played down there all the time at the time. They all played differently, but I watched how they played rhythm as much as anything. And I would, and then I would go to other places and it was just guitar land here then, man. It was like there was like, I mean, Eric Johnson, Stevie would come through all that. He was whenever he was in town, he was down hanging at Antone's, and then Clifford was bringing in Otis Rush, Albert Collins, Jimmy Rogers. You know, just there was always somebody hanging there. Hubert Sumlin, and I got to meet all these guys and play with some of them, and I got a real, it was an education, and I tried to study hard.
Hearing you tell the story now, it seems like it happened rather quickly for you. Did it feel like it at the time, or at any point were you discouraged?
No, I was never discouraged, and it did happen quickly. And well, it happened at a steady pace. Every day was an exciting. Every day I woke up, I was excited, and I can't really that period of time. I don't ever really remember being bummed out about anything because I had a lot of gigs, and if I didn't have a gig, I could go hear the music I loved. And then shortly after Lou Ann's band, I got a call from Joe Ely in '85. And a week later, I mean, back before it was, you could really expedite a passport. I'd never been out of the country. They expedited my passport. And a week later, I was on a plane to Australia. And it was like, man, I thought going to Louisiana, New Orleans was a big deal. Here I am going to Australia. And how do you put it in words? I don't know. I'm 25 years old at that point, and I'm 24, 23, and I'm as far away from home as you can get, playing music with this guy that who influenced me to move to Austin, and in the process of getting to know him and learn his songs and see how he encouraged me, becomes my mentor. And at the same time, we were running buddies. It wasn't like I work for Joe. Was never like, you work for me, you'll do this. It was like, I want you to step up and do your thing. And uh, I think he was so unique. He's such a unique musician and a unique artist in that with Joe, the songs we played and the way the sets went, we played everything from the quietest ballads you can imagine to the most balls to the wall, rocked out stuff. I mean, the Clash took him on tour. The Clash, he influenced this Joe Strummer and those guys. I mean, his energy levels. And at the same time, the integrity in his songwriting and the songs that he picked, and the integrity in the choices he made, and the choices he did, the things that he turned down that maybe would have been a path to more commercial success. But I saw then a little bit, and I see way more now, how true he was to his vision and how that wisdom has really paid off for him. And he's playing more gigs now than he was back then. And I'm sure, as far as I can tell, extremely fulfilled in what he's doing and continue to evolve.
What are some of the key lessons you learned from your experience with Joe?
I would say the first thing that comes to mind is in the 5 years I played with Joe full time, I never once, ever once saw him not give 110%. And there was a night we played in Germany where there might have been 10 people in the audience. The PA was falling apart. It's cold, rainy. We've been in Europe for a month. You're tired. The average person is going to walk out on that stage with a heavy, like, oh, shoot, here we go, man. Got to slog through this thing. Just get me back to the hotel. He came out and kicked ass harder than I've ever seen him in my entire, in the whole time I'm working with him. So that right there was, if you're not going to show up, don't even put your guitar on. That really was an eye opener for me. Just his commitment to it, the way he treated all of us as brothers really influenced me a lot. About the dynamics of being in a band are unbelievably complicated. And it was the most relaxed, fun experience I've ever had being in a band. The use of dynamics and the encouragement he gave me to find my own voice on the guitar. I mean, those are the main things that I would point to.
How did your stint on Joe Ely's band come to an end?
Well, it ended when I got the offer to go to Mellencamp's band, which is something that actually I had to really think about because I was really devoted to Joe and I loved the band. But at the same time, I felt like this, Mellencamp, that Kenny was in the band. I knew him. It was really guitar oriented and it was a good fit. And obviously, I mean, I get a chance to make records that a million people are going to hear, and I get to play in arenas and find out what that's all about. And so that's how that happened.
How did Joe take the news?
I think I took it harder than he did. I mean, he was totally cool. He's like, yeah, you got to do it. I mean, you've got to do it.
Before I ask you what the experience was like playing in John Mellencamp's band, I should preface this by saying that I listened to an interview with Kenny Aronoff, and heard him describe what the experience was like, and I gather that it was pretty different from the experience with Joe Ely.
It was not even close. Everything I just told you, at the exact opposite. What did Kenny say?
Basically, that John is a very very talented, very complex, and in some ways complicated individual that at one point told him that he flat out doesn't like musicians. Yet he is who he is, and he's made a career working with other musicians, and that he could be incredibly demanding. And Kenny said that he had, in a sense, been prepared for that just by the very nature of how hard he worked and how hard he prepared, and his experience at music school in Indiana, and the incredibly demanding professors he had there. So he felt he had the chops and the background to do it, but just talked about how challenging it was. And I gathered that it was very much the opposite of what you described in Joey Lee's band.
It was a total opposite. Kenny's probably more diplomatic about it than I would be. But I've always tried to take the high road in this situation, even though John does not take the high road with regard to the way I left the band. He came through Austin and said basically a bunch of stuff that wasn't true about me in the paper here after I declined to talk about the circumstances of me leaving the band, which were really not very flattering to him. But I've always taken the high road, and that's about all I'm going to say to that extent. But I will say that, yes, it was he doesn't like musicians. He is very smart. The thing I learned most from John musically was when we worked in the studio, in which, as a producer, he's almost brilliant about the way he's able to take a 3-chord song and these 3-chord folk songs and direct them and make them become something much bigger than that. And my time with him was a double-edged sword. To be honest with you, man, there was stuff about it that was actually emotionally traumatic that I had to endure working with him. But at the same time, I learned stuff that was that I use to this day, and that it was invaluable. So while in the process of going through hell, there was a lot to be learned, and I took advantage of it and kept my eyes and ears open the entire time and asked engineers questions. Why are you using that mic? How are you getting this sound? And his process of working in the studio was what really was invaluable. And listen, when things were good, when things were going well, like the song came quickly, and we were all a team, and it was going great, or if the show was great, or if if he was in a good mood, it was fun. It was really, really fun. But when it wasn't going well, it was pretty miserable.
Were most of the lessons that you took, or the learnings that you took from that experience, centered on the studio and the recording process and production?
Well, I also learned, I would say those are the most valuable ones, but I learned a lot about, first of all, playing arenas is different than playing clubs. And so there's a whole way that, you sort of have to communicate on a bigger scale. But I learned way more about playing live from Joe I mean, I'd gotten that foundation, and it really wasn't that big of an adjustment to go do the John thing. But um, again, yeah, I think that his method of working in the studio was really, I mean, that's his strong suit.
Tell me about Storyville.
Storyville, we had Chris Layton and Tommy Shannon rhythm section, and another great guitar player, David Holt. Uh, so two guitars, bass, and drums, and then Malford Milligan singing, who's just a one of a kind powerhouse singer. And when I left John's band in '93, I kind of hit this crossroads, of which there have been many, many crossroads. As anybody that does this long enough, it's a constant coming to the T in the road, and which way do you turn? And I left John's band and got the offer to do Rod Stewart. And at the same time, Chris Layton called me and said, "Hey, we're putting this band together. This is what we're thinking. This is who it is." And went out and met all everybody and heard Malford sing. And I'm like, wow. And so the Rod Stewart thing was like about 35% more money a week than I was making with John, which was like astronomically more than I'd ever made in my life. But in my gut, and I think maybe this is something that I picked up from Joe Ely, my gut told me that that Storyville was the way to go. That I was gonna, that the more musical path, the more growth was hanging out with these guys. And I don't, there was no guarantee where it was going to go, but I felt like it had enormous potential. And I mean, I really felt like Storyville was going to be big. I really thought we were going to do it. I realized that my wife, the only time in my whole career that I've been married that my wife told me she thought I was making a mistake, was when I turned down Rod Stewart and did Storyville. But I knew that if I kind of sensed that if I did Rod Stewart, I'd be going from John to Rod, flying in the private jets all over the place. That I'm going to give up 5 years, another 5 years probably, and I just didn't want to really do this country club rock band thing. And I say that I don't mean that condescendingly, but it's so alluring because you're staying in these beautiful hotels and you're flying in a private jet and everything. But really, man, at least John, I got to play on the records and come up with my own parts and everything. But with Rod, man, it's a cover band. Basically, you're recreating the records. And there's a time in my life where, the money really is needed and appreciated, and the experience, you can sort of, there are so many things to be learned, even though you are playing basically cover stuff. But I felt like I had done that, and the meat and potatoes was really with Storyville, and that was the choice I made at that point.
How did the songwriting process work in Storyville?
Everybody wrote. Some of the songs people would write individually. Some of the songs, two of us would get together and write. Some of the songs came about with all of us in the room, and we shared the writing credit on it. So it was, more than one way to skin that cat.
I read somewhere, and I don't know exactly when this would have happened, that you co-wrote hundreds of songs through a publishing deal. Did you enjoy that? Did you enjoy the process of collaborating with someone else and just churning out songs?
I enjoyed it for a while, and I don't regret 1 minute of it, because I learned. I mean, I got to co-write with guys that are and women, men and women both, way more experienced writers than myself, and my publisher was able to, get me these co-writes, and it was, it became apparent to me how much of it was just sitting down and working. It's not like, I mean, even Bob Dylan has to sit down every day and work at it. It's a craft. And every person I co-wrote with had a little different way of working. And so it was like going to school and at the same time getting paid for it. But what I found was, after about 8 years of it, I wrote some songs. This was mainly in Nashville, and I got some songs cut, like Trisha Yearwood, Leanne Womack, Montgomery Gentry. And then I had some blues stuff cut. John Mayall and Shannon Curfman each cut one of my songs. But after about 8 years of it, what I realized, and I think it sort of coincided with me making my first record, was that I had this huge catalog of songs. And I'd, like go onto my computer in one night and I just start listening to them song after song after song after song, and there really weren't any in there that I would put on my record. And a light bulb kind of went off, and I said, maybe it's time that I write songs that I want to put on my record. And coincidentally, at the same time, there was kind of a regime change at the publisher I was working for. They weren't really listening to the stuff that I was turning in that much, it didn't seem like. So I elected to sort of just get out of the publishing deal. And as soon as I did that, I started writing songs that I wanted to record. And not to say that some of the songs that I wrote, there were lots of those songs that I wrote back then I'm really proud of, but I think I found my voice more when I quit trying to write for other people.
I read a quote from you in which you said, "I listened to some of my stuff from 20 years ago, and I appreciate the testosterone, but there are some cringe moments too." How would you describe your music as having evolved from 20 years ago to what you do now?
I think undeniably, when you're 23 and you get lucky enough to play with somebody like Joe Ely, and you're driving around the country in a van playing 6 nights a week, and you're not getting a lot of sleep, and every night you're hanging after the gig, and it influences it would influence the way I play it. I mean, there was certainly, this reckless abandon, and also, I think subtly, not consciously doing it or thinking about it, but I was developing my style. So this incredible enthusiasm for, in Joe's band, like, combining these pedal steel licks through, I got my first vintage Marshall, and I got my first PRS, and this combination, all this stuff started to really click. And I would literally feel like I was levitating some nights when I was playing. But at the same time, when I listen to some of it now, it's like it's over the top, and it's, I feel like now I'm able to, at least I can still play with the same kind of energy, but maybe do it in a more compelling way, I guess. And I have more to draw on, more influences and more experience to draw on. I mean, there are parts that I came up with on records back in that I'm like I'm super proud of. I mean, I really am very, very proud of all the stuff I did with Joe and the records that I played on back then. But I do feel like now when I play with my band on Tuesday nights, that I levitate higher than I did back then on most of those nights. I mean, it's a religious experience, and I just feel like I'm more seasoned.
I read an interview with Tom Petty in which he said something to the effect of songwriting, he didn't really understand how it happened, and that songs just came to him. That's an oversimplification, but it can still be frustrating for an aspiring songwriter to hear that. How do you write?
Well, first of all, I want to tell you that one of the greatest quotes I've ever heard about songwriting is another quote from Tom Petty. He said, it was on Storytellers, that VH1 thing where you're supposed to talk about all the songs, and he introduced a song, and he goes, I can't really say what this song is about, but I damn sure know what was going on when I wrote it. And to me, that explained that put into words, like, because to me, he is the master of the simple lyric that resonates on a lot of different levels. And I love that, man. When you don't have to be Bob Dylan or Leonard Cohen to write something that that resonates deeply with people. And the trick being, if you can write simply, but to avoid cliche. And I kind of feel like you sort of have to have a certain depth to be able to do that. In other words, it's like Pat Metheny said once, when Keith Jarrett plays A minor to F, it really means something. And that's what I'm talking about. I mean, Tom has studied all these songwriters, all these people he grew up with and idolized. He learned all those songs. He knows about songs. I love his Sirius XM channel. I have it on my car half the time just to hear him talk about songs and the way they affected him as he was growing up. But how do I write? It's 1,000 different ways. Most of the time, it'll start with a musical idea, and I would say that I have 20 musical ideas for every lyric idea. And depending on where I am, or if I'm sitting down with a guitar, I'll just play it over and over and over again. And if I get a melody, cool. And my best friend now is my iPhone, the voice memos, and I capture it all, because you lose all this stuff if you don't capture it the minute you come up with it. And if I'm lucky, I'll get a read on what does this feel like? What is this groove and this melody? What does it feel like? And what I mean by that is like, what emotion does that bring up with me? And, maybe a phrase or a word or just a vibe will come to mind, and I might sketch out a few lyrics. And in a perfect world, a title. And once I sort of have the groove and an idea about what it feels like and what it might be about, I can finish it. There's just so many different ways to do it. Sometimes I'll start with a title, or I'll start with an idea, or I'll hear a turn of, somebody will say something and it'll fire something in my memory. A lot of times reading books, a lot of times watching movies. Like when I go to a movie, I have a very, very hard time telling you what the movie was about a week later, because there's so many things that happen in the movie theater for me visually, or what somebody will say, or this just will make music start firing in my brain to the point where when people like talk about, like they saw a certain movie, and yeah, remember when that scene like that? I'm like, I have no recollection of it whatsoever. So it's I think we all work differently. And if I'm co-writing, it's a whole different experience altogether too. And it depends on who I'm writing with as to how we'll approach it. A lot of times I'll write with people that really just write lyrics, and to me that's like going on vacation, because I've got music for years, and I'm really good at coming up with. I mean, I can give you a whole set of chords and a melody that I'm happy with on spur of the moment, and like a good lyric writer. I wrote a lot of songs with the guy, 7 or 8 songs, not a lot of songs, but with Chris Stapleton when he first came to Nashville. And now, I mean, he's one of the most talented people I've ever been around in my entire life. And there were songs that we wrote together where it was, lyrically 50-50. There were a couple of songs where I just played and hummed a melody, and he took a piece of paper and a pencil, and 15 minutes later we had a finished song. And incidentally, he has the #1 record in the country this week. It's after he did the CMAs the other night. He's so undeniably talented. All it took, just like people to hear the guy. And it was, he sold like 200,000 copies of his record last week. And of all the people I've ever co-written with, I have to say he may be the stoutest, most talented, easiest to write with, and just, almost, there were times when I was almost in awe of his ability to take something I was feeling and just boom, here's the title, here's what it's about. And then we're off to the races. I mean, we rarely spent more than 2 hours on writing a song.
When you say that musical ideas come to you and that you have many of them at any given point in time, is it usually a riff, a chord progression, a melody, or any of the above?
All of the above. And really what I find to be true, I find that when I first sit down with the guitar, that's when it's a paradox. I try to empty my brain, my mind, have an empty canvas, and at the same time, really be mindful in those first 5 minutes, because that's where the fresh ideas are going to probably happen, or they have a good likelihood of happening when you first pick up the instrument. Having said that, I also find that 45 minutes down the road, all of a sudden you stumble onto something cool too. And I always record anything that I feel is cool that I can go back and listen to. And I do feel, I have to justify this to my wife every time I trade or get another guitar. Every guitar has different songs in it. And I've had guitars that I've written really great songs on that I kind of felt like I wrote, I sort of gotten all the songs out of it, and I'll go down to Austin Vintage Guitars or whatever and try to trade for something different. Um, but literally, I mean, you line up 5 acoustic guitars, and each one of them has a little bit different story in it, especially like if they've been around the block and they have some miles on them. And I also have made a concerted effort lately to write more playing an electric guitar, because normally at the house I'm writing with an acoustic guitar, but it's like it may seem obvious to the average to the average person, but duh, for me, the guitar, the guitar player, when I've got an electric guitar and an amp, I play differently. So, and I use the computer sometimes too. I'll lay down an idea, I'll just set like a cool drum loop, and I'll lay the idea down, and over, just play it and listen to it and try to come up with a melody and lyric for it. And then I'll maybe come up with a different section, and then I'll put that in the computer, and all of a sudden I'm building this song that way. So as much as I bemoan the loss of analog tape and of all of us playing in the room, cutting the whole record at once, um, the other side of the coin is that I have this new way to work on my own and write songs.
Let's touch on guitars for a moment. You're well known for playing PRS guitars. I also read that one of your first guitars was a 1960 Strat, originally Dakota Red and painted over with Fiesta Red. Do you still have it?
I still have it. I still have it. When I moved to Austin, it was the only guitar I owned, and it was painted Fiesta Red at the factory. It's not a refin, and I sweated through the Fiesta Red and saw this darker red underneath, and I'm thinking, oh man, did I somehow get a refinished guitar? Because I bought it in Memphis in 1980, paid $400 for it, and I moved down here. It was my only guitar. And there was a guy at Ray Hennick's Heart of Texas Music over on Lamar, a guy named Danny Thorpe. And he, along with Charlie Wirtz, they're both no longer with us anymore, started the first vintage guitar show. And he knew more about vintage guitars than anybody around here. And I became friends with him immediately. And he told me, he said, I used to have one exactly like it. He said, this is what Fender did. He knew before, like, he knew because he knew the guys at Fender, and he'd done the research. So he explained to me what had happened. And then, about 6 months later, I'm over at this little rehearsal complex, and Stevie's in there rehearsing, and he had a Fiesta Red one that was originally sunburst underneath. You could see the dark brown blacky, the black edge coming through. So yeah, that guitar, I mean, I still have it. I tried to sell it a couple of times, and my wife would not let me sell the guitar.
Are you glad now that
Yeah, I'm thrilled. I mean, it's part of, and it was sentimental for her because that, when she knew me, I mean, I had a Honda Civic and that guitar, and it reminds her of, when we first met, and God bless her. I mean,
Do you play it often, or is it stashed away?
I don't play it often because, I've got that. I've got another old Strat that's a maple neck, a 54, which is
Wow.
really a different, different sounding Strat. I fantasy, I keep thinking I'm going to play them more. I record with them when I need that sound, but the thing for me about a Strat is I play differently on a Strat. A Strat, and even a Les Paul too. These guitars that are iconic guitars. There's so much that I kind of feel like the book has been written on them. With a Strat, I'm gonna go to that Wind Cries Mary thing immediately, or I'm gonna get into Jeff Beck world. Um, with a Les Paul, I'm gonna be, channeling Dwayne. I mean, trying to channel Dwayne Allman and early Billy Gibbons. Somehow or other, about 1985, when I moved, I saw almost every guitar player in Austin was playing a Strat. Something inside said, you need to get a different guitar. And then I saw this turquoise PRS. It was the first year they were out. I thought, and it just spoke to me. And, I've got great vintage guitars. And when I do sessions, you got to have a great Telly, a great Strat, a great Gretsch, a great 335. Les Paul, I have a Les Paul Jr. I've got a Les Paul. I mean, you have to have all these things. And if you're going to make records on any kind of level, it's certainly when I was working in Nashville, producers, if nothing else, they want to know you've got them. Mm-hmm. But I've always been attracted to playing something different. And I truly feel like by doing that, and with the PRS and initially vintage Marshalls, it helped me define my sound and come up with a sound that I think people tell me they recognize.
Would you say that you have a single favorite acoustic or a single favorite electric, or is there no way to pick one? It's like picking a favorite child.
It's really difficult. I mean, how do you pick between a 335 and a Tele? So I have a 59 335 that is my favorite humbucking vintage guitar, and I have a 52 Tele that's my favorite single coil vintage guitar. I have a 42. I just got a 42 Martin D18. It has the headstock has been broken off. The fingerboard has been replaced. It's had about 20 repaired body cracks. It weighs about 3 pounds, and it is total magic. And I paid like nothing for it. I mean, it's a pre-war D18 can be $50,000 if it's all original.
Mm-hmm.
This was peanuts
Mm-hmm.
because of everything that had happened to it. But it is one thing I learned from Brian Sutton, who's like to me the greatest younger bluegrass guitar player there is. Was I noticed he was always playing these guitars that had been put back together and were beat up, and so I had the chance to go up to Carter Vintage Guitars in Nashville, and they had like, I've always wanted a D18 since I was in high school. This Norman Blake record, Whiskey Before Breakfast, and he was playing like a pre-war D18, and the tone he got, I always wanted. I, dreamt of having one that could sound like that. And I walked into Carter's, and they had 6 pre-war D18s, and I got to play them all in this one that had been, totally run over and put back together. It sounded better than any of them. So at the moment, there's that one that, but then in new guitars, I mean, to me, Collings acoustics, I've got a varnish finish Collings acoustic that's just, it is unbelievable. And then I've got a couple of PRS that, my signature model that do everything. And they really, I mean, when we designed that guitar, the idea was to take the best of both worlds, get a new guitar that was consistent from guitar to guitar, that I could travel all around the world with. It didn't have to worry about any maintenance on it whatsoever, but yet felt and sounded like a vintage instrument. So there's a couple of those that I like, I put right up there, and I choose as often and more often, really, when I'm going on the road or playing live. There's some other builders out there that are making instruments that dare to be different. And I mean, it's a lot of, I understand the fascination with wanting to have these iconic instruments because our heroes played them. But I mean, for me at this point, and at some point and continuing through to this day, I also value the guys that are, the Leo Fenders of our era that are building a better mousetrap sometimes, not always. Having said that, no new guitar sounds like the 42 D18. No new guitar sounds like my 52 Tele, and no new guitar sounds like the 59 335. The PAFs that are in that guitar are indescribable. And I've owned several guitars with PAFs and played 30, 40, 50 of them, and they all sound completely different. So, so that's a really long-winded answer to what's my favorite guitar.
You touched on something interesting to me though, which is the fact that these vintage instruments, select vintage instruments, in a sense, are the benchmark now for the epitome and just the pinnacle of some of the sounds that we all love. And part of me wonders if it's simply because they were the first, or if they truly were that much better, objectively better back then, or if they simply happened to be the first, and thus by default they became the de facto standards that we now aspire to match.
Well, I think the first thing you have to think about is that when the solid body electric guitar came out, it was blasphemous to most guitar players. So the guys that had the courage to pick these things up are it's the same idea that I'm talking about now. It's like, I've had people talk and say that I'm, until I start playing a real guitar, I'm never going to have a chance at being taken seriously. I mean, this is like, there is a real prejudice, and especially amongst sort of traditional retro-minded people, that you can't take a PRS and run it through a new amp and make it sound as good as vintage stuff. And, that's just ignorance, I think, because first of all, there are a lot of PRSs. That's really true. They're designed for something totally different, but not. I designed the one that I play to do something completely different than most of the other instruments that they have. But I think it's a combination of the guys having the courage to pick these things up and play them. But you're dealing with the wood was consistently better back then. It was aged more. It was from an older growth trees. I think that gives the instruments the potential to be better instruments acoustically. The primitive ways they made pickups worked in their favor. The small amount or the lack of wax potting it can either make it scream and be unusable, or it adds a vocal quality to it that you can't get in a new pickup.
Mm-hmm.
So in the important thing that I like to point out to people is, I've been lucky enough to own and play hundreds of vintage guitars. And I would say 1 out of 10 is truly magic. The other 9, you might as well get a reissue. That's just my experience. Other people would disagree with that, but that has been my experience.
Let's talk a little about performing. I was going to ask you a question that you already answered. You mentioned that you levitate more now than you did 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I've read interviews with certain musicians to whom it almost appears like performing is a necessary evil. And I've spoken with others to whom it's a core part of their musical identity and one of the core reasons why they do it. And it sounds like you're very much in the latter camp, that it's just something that fulfills you and something that you aspire to do and look forward to doing every Tuesday night at the Saxon
Yeah,
Pub
me
now?
too. That hour and a half on Tuesday nights is my church, and I can be feeling terrible. I can actually absolutely be exhausted and down in the dumps, and 30 seconds into the first song, I feel uplifted and reminded about everything that's wonderful about the world. And but I do think there's a difference. You can make a distinction between performing and going on the road.
Mm-hmm.
It's there's 2 aspects to it. There's the traveling part of it, and there's the playing part of it. Some people love both parts of it. Some people like the performing part but don't like the traveling part, because you're working 24 hours a day essentially when you're in a van or a bus with 8 other stinky guys, and on certain tours waking up in a concrete arena smelling, breathing diesel fumes. You're working 24 hours, but you get paid for an hour and a half. That's the way I look at it. But it depends what I'm playing. I went to Europe earlier this year and I did 26 shows in 31 days in 7 countries. It was exhausting, but man, I got to play my stuff, and people came to the shows and responded, and it was really uplifting. And I'm just at a point now, I've been a sideman for the bulk of my career. And you know what? Let me tell you what. It's way easier showing up and just playing guitar for somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Let them do all the talk and let them worry about the set list. Let everybody look to them. Let the review, it's so much easier just showing up and playing guitar. But it's way more rewarding to be able to work with the great players that I get to work with and have that experience and connect on a level that's way deeper and than it is when you're going out and playing a show, quote in quotes, a show.
Mm-hmm.
We get up there every Tuesday night and I have a list of about 50 songs, and before we walk up there, let's do this one first, and from then on it's just whatever I feel like calling. And I know that the guys are so good that each time we play these songs, they're going to be different. And that's what keeps your blood flowing.
At this stage in your career, are you very self-critical after a show? Or have you learned that there's some nights that are better than others? Learn to accept that some nights are better than others.
Yeah, I've learned to accept that some nights are better than others. And I also have learned that sometimes when I think it's not a great night, that people in the audience like it better. And I think it's this weird subliminal thing that if I'm sort of struggling a little bit, like if the sound's not great or my chops don't feel like they're totally up to par for whatever reason, and I refuse to give in to that, and I'm gonna give 110% no matter what. That there's a thing that people that are listening or that are in the crowd, they relate to that, because we all struggle, man. That's what life is, a struggle. I mean, it's not easy most of the time, and so I've learned to not carry that away from the gig with me. If say, I don't, in the last 4 years, I've had 2 or 3, maybe a total of 5 nights where I felt like I didn't, or honestly was disappointed with the way I played. And so that's a pretty good batting average. And the other thing is, now when I go to the gig, when I play, for various reasons, just evolving, hopefully, as a human being, my focus is a large part of the focus that try to bring with me is not so much how can I sound great, or how can I make people think I'm really good, as opposed to how can I somehow transmit something that makes people feel good.
Hmm.
And it's, sort of getting out of that self-centeredness of making, just putting, it's not about me so much. It's way more about the music and involving the people that are in the audience, in the room, in the whole experience. And that's where the joy comes. And I think that has changed my perspective. My perspective has changed, and has changed. It's sort of up the percentage of good gigs for me.
You mentioned a moment ago that you work with great musicians. When putting together a band, what do you look for in a bass player? What do you look for in a drummer?
Well, that they understand the music, that they're compatible musically. That's the main thing. And I think secondly, personality. Are they team players? Are they reliable? How much experience do they have? Can I count on, when things go south, when I break a guitar string, when a bass drum pedal breaks, are we all cool with all that? We know how to handle it.
Hmm.
Um, but ultimately, it's, and it's interesting too, because I feel like there's no hard and fast rule to that. Do they understand the music? Because we have gone through, a couple of different changes in our band, but everybody brings a diverse thing to it, and that really appeals to me. Like, I don't, because that's just where I'm coming from. It's stylistically covers so many different areas, and that, one guy's more rock oriented, one guy's more blues oriented, and a couple of guys I play with are really heavy duty jazz cats, but they also know how to they know a bunch of Led Zeppelin songs, and I hope and I feel like that have embraced those differences with the guys that I work with, and you have a much better chance, I think, of, if you play to people's strengths and not try to mold it and guide it too much, of coming up with something much more unique.
If you had to make a laundry list of why you think you've had the success you've had in your career, what attributes or what qualities or strokes of luck, what do you think has enabled you to have the success you've had?
Luck, luck, and more luck, and by that, not just blind luck, but you know, um, the guitar teachers that I had early on, the different influences that they turned me on to, um, meeting, meeting Kenny Aronoff when I was 18, and riding on his coattails a little bit and have him mentor me a bit. Um, the breaks that I got when I got into Austin, um, invaluable. But somewhere along the line, I think it had to do with, one of the things I was brought up with. Sort of, I heard a lot of talk about integrity growing up, and sort of looking at the big long picture, and that combined with my experience with Joe, and seeing, not probably being able to put it into words at the time, but having the sense that I was in the presence of someone who was a true artist, Joe Ely, really influenced my whole decision-making process from that point on. And when I came to these forks in the road I talked about earlier, I always chose the one that I felt was going to let me learn the most and didn't necessarily go for the most money. And as a result, I think if you added what I turned down and what I chose, I probably ended up, the money probably all even out at the end, but something much more important is I became a much better musician, and I've had a much more fulfilling experience through music because of that.
Do you think the most feasible way for a musician nowadays to earn a living is simply by being diverse, doing session work, giving lessons, producing, mixing, being a sideman, doing some solo work? What do you think are the keys to for someone trying to make it now?
I think now you have to do all that stuff. I mean, I really do. I don't think it's not like it used to be where you could just be maybe you could just be a session player if you moved to Nashville, but the money is not like it used to be. The competition is bigger. There are fewer records being made. I think you have to do it all. I mean, you have to play the gigs. You have to know how to do sessions. You have to write songs. You have to teach in some way, shape, or form. You don't have to do all these things, but you have to be open to doing them all because, I mean, let's face it, man, living in Austin, playing gigs around town, if you got I don't have kids, but if you have kids, forget about it. I mean, you're not going to make any kind of living unless your wife has a good job or your husband if you're a woman. I mean, it requires a lot of imagination. But the having said all that is, the way with a computer and a cheap interface now, you can make your own record. And if you're good and if you're committed to it, you can make money selling records. And actually, I think we're not that far off as much as people, bemoan streaming and Spotify and all that. That's the future. I mean, every time I make a CD, I think it's the last one I'm actually going to press up. I'm probably going to do at least one more, but at the end of the day, you either do this because you have to or you don't do it at all. And this will weed out the weak. The climate we're in right now will weed out the weak for sure, because you either have to, this is what you do because you have to do it, or you're going to move on to something else in a hurry.
David, I really appreciate your time. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with David as much as I did. Until next time.